Hi, this is Rabbi Jon Spira-Savett, and this is another installment of 36 to Life. I'm recording these at 12:36 p.m. throughout the month of Elul, leading to Rosh Hashanah. 36 is 2 times 18. 18 is the number value of the Hebrew word chai, which means life, and 36 is 2 times that. So a chance to look back on our life in the past year and think about the life we want to have in the new year. And one way to do that, or sort of help us focus, is to do some short study about concepts of teshuvah, of return, which is the Jewish concept for change and for reorienting and redirecting and getting back on the path. So each of these is a short look at some teaching, mostly from the teaching of Rabbi Moses Maimonides, Rambam, from the Middle Ages, in his Hilchot Teshuvah, his guide to Teshuvah. And we'll dive in and pick up where we were. The first teaching, of which this is the second half, sort of laid out the idea of vidui, of acknowledgement, or as it's often translated, confession. So let me put the teaching back up on the screen, and we'll kind of pick it up from where we were. V'zehu ikaro shel vidui. He had laid out what is the essence of acknowledgement. V'chol hamarbe lehitvadot uma'arich be'inyan zeh harei zeh mishubach. Anybody who does a lot of acknowledgement and who goes to some length in this matter, that person is deserving of praise. And you might recognize that language from the Passover Haggadah, where we talk about anybody who talks more and more about the story of the Exodus from Egypt is deserving of praise. So here he's talking about this is not a cursory practice. And he had laid out before that there's some specific things you have to do when you are confessing or acknowledging, in terms of talking about what specifically you did and how you feel about it and how you are resolving to do differently. And here he's saying this is not something you do just once and in a cursory fashion. And one of the things that he goes on, and I'm not going to read this specifically in the text here, is to say that that people who in the past would have brought sacrifices according to the Torah for things that they had done wrong, even though the sacrifice is very important, they wouldn't get atonement. They wouldn't be cleansed in the eyes of the divine until they would also do teshuvah, demonstrated turning, and also confess with a confession of words. And he goes on and talks about some of the very extreme things which people might have to do and even be punished for under Torah law, that they still would have to do this. The punishment is not enough. V'chein hachovel b'chaveiro v'hamazik mamono. And even someone who like physically injures another person or damages their money or property, afal pisha shilem lo, even though they paid them back, they repaid what they owed as a result of this. Mashu chayav lo eno mitkaper ad sheyitfadeh v'yashuv milasod kazeh. That person is not cleansed again in the presence of the divine until they, and here he puts it as which I think is a little different, opposite of what he had said before. They have to confess and then turn or return from doing a similar kind of thing like that. And he sort of concludes with this quote from chapter 5 of the book of Numbers, from Mikol Chatot Adam, from any of the wrongs or any of the sins that a person does. And one of the things I'm thinking about is, again, to emphasize that a person might actually even go through some sort of reconciliation process, which is outside, external. You pay someone back, or you somehow make good in an external way, not just a material way, but in a way that's palpable for another person. And some of that might also involve words that are exchanged between, and maybe words of apology and reconciliation. And even so, there's an extra element even after that, or at least in addition to that, alongside that, of having to spell these things out and to speak them oneself in the presence of God in some kind of fashion, which, as I said in the first teaching, is not dependent on the way that another person hears it at all, or the way in which it might be colored by how we adjust ourselves to somebody else. I am noticing that Maimonides here is quoting from a couple of different places. One of them is kind of general, and one of them is talking particularly about a kind of a kind of wrong that in the Torah is known as me'ilah, which means when you take something which is dedicated for a sacred purpose, and then you use it for a purpose that's not sacred. So in ancient times or in temple times, if a person were to say, you know, I'm going to take this particular animal for a sacrifice, and then you didn't do that, you kept it for personal use to earn a living from, or to eat privately or something like that, that was considered to be a kind of stealing back from the divine. Another way, and maybe a little more in our modern idiom, is if a person said, I'm going to give this money to tzedakah, I'm going to use this money for charitable purposes, and then you either use that same actual sum for personal purposes, or even use it for other purposes that might be good, but just weren't for that dedication. And that's actually where for some reason Maimonides locates initially the teaching about vidui devarim, about having to spell things out. And I think it's always significant the way that Maimonides chooses the verses he quotes when he has a choice of what to do. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of paradigm here where he's talking about sacred things in the sense of things that are uplifted by our own acts for holy purposes, and what happens when we go back on that or we don't follow through. And it could be that what he's saying is that generally our lives and our own capacities and the things we have can be used for sacred purposes, so that anytime we don't do that, we're kind of dishonoring the gift of our own selves, whether it's our speech or our capacities or our activities, and that therefore it sort of all falls in the category of we are presumptively dedicated to sacred purposes, and when we don't follow through, that's the situation. Or maybe what he's saying is that there is a way in which our regular words, even through the course of the year, create most of our words are sacred in some kind of sense. We use words that are affirming and that seem to give an impression of love or a desire for things to be good toward other people all the time. And in a way, this might be sort of a first cousin to the idea of vows. I'm just thinking this out loud as I'm talking right now. Maybe what he's saying is that a declaration that something is sacred follows kind of either our conscious verbalizing of something or just kind of an intent we have. And once we sort of begin to do something, or we deign to express something which is a thought, which is a thought of chesed, or a thought of caring, or initiating an intention of compassion, that intention has to be followed through, whether we were sort of fully aware of that intention or not. And then maybe he's trying to turn around and say that the actions we need to be particularly sensitive for and to acknowledge when we don't do them are when we claim to be representing ourselves as kind or as caring or as helping in some way, and then we don't do that. And we have to kind of call that out. For me, this kind of goes back, and here I'm a little bit stretching beyond the contours and the words of this particular teaching. I think about how in Yom Kippur, there was the way in which the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, and that was the only time that the name of God could be spoken out loud by that person in this most holy place. And I think there was this idea that word was dangerous to use in regular speech, because it could be sort of drained of its meaning, or drained of the way in which it would affect us by being used in regular speech. And therefore it required this process of cleansing, or being in, this was Yom Kippur, this was the same kind of cleansing that Maimonides was referring to in this teaching, the same verbiage of Kippur and Kapara. And maybe in a way what he's trying to say is that we have to be really careful and just noticing. His whole teaching about vidui here, acknowledging, is to be able to say out loud things that we have done. And if we have said I love you, that creates an obligation. Or if we have even called on other people to act more out of love or peace or something like that, and we have used those words casually or in a halfway fashion, or we've seem to present ourselves in a way that we don't deliver on, that's the same as taking an object or an animal or some money and dedicating it to holy purposes and not following through. And for that, we need to acknowledge. And I think it's interesting to think about that as a paradigm, thinking about more things in our contemporary lives as sacred things that we then have to follow through on. Maimonides is well aware that he's choosing to introduce his section about teshuvah at a time when the temple doesn't exist, so he can't be talking literally about the sacrifices. And he's quite aware that that he's putting this whole set of teaching not in the seasonal teachings of his code of Jewish law, but in his general kind of foundations of Jewish belief and of Jewish principle and of qualities that a person should live by. So I think this is how it's possible that he might be trying to use a particular category that started in the world of sacrifices and brings it out and elaborates how we think about that. So what do we take away from this? Again, I think it's the second half of a teaching about the necessity of acknowledging things in our own language, the language that's between us and the ultimate reality, the divine, and to be aware that they may flow from ways we've presented ourselves and we've bounced around in the world, but are somehow purified of all the things that sort of hold us back when we try to calibrate our words to the ways other people are responding, and this importance of vidui, of confession. I hope you'll think about that and where there might be some application. Think about if you have any questions about that to talk to post comments about or to talk to other people about, and check in. Please join me live for these conversations too, and take part in them, or share them in some way that other people can share them with you or learn about them on their own.